Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our West Side Wellness Weekend. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here for this conversation. I first want to introduce our Wellness Weekend. Today is our first day kicking it off. And this whole month of May, NAMI Westside LA will have free, engaging virtual events just like this one to promote education, advocacy, and overall wellness. And we also encourage you to check out our resources that operate year-round, our support groups, and our free classes. They're for both peers living with mental health conditions and their family members. And I'll be sure to put all of these resources in the chat. So go ahead and check those out. We want to make sure that mental health resources are accessible to our community. But this afternoon, we're so excited to welcome Paul Gilmartin, Andrew Solomon, and Juan Acosta to have this conversation on mental health advocacy and intersectionality. It's such a great way to kick off Mental Health Month. So our moderator was the co-host of TBS's Dinner and a Movie from 1995 to 2011, and has been the host of Mental Illness Happy Hour podcasts since 2011. Named one of the best mental health podcasts by the New York Times, please welcome Paul Gilmartin. Oh, Paul, I think you're muted.
That would be about the 100th time I've done that in the quarantine. So I think I get a prize for that one. I'm very happy to be here, Elizabeth, and thank you for inviting me. Our first guest is an LGBTQ plus mental health advocate and speaker who serves on national committees. He's a New York Times bestselling author for a book that he co-authored with Lady Gaga called Channel Kindness. He currently serves as the Cal Hope Warm Lime Regional Manager. Please welcome Juan Acosta. Hey, Juan.
Hey, Paul. Thank you so much for that introduction. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for being here. Let's bring in our other panelist. He's a professor of medical psychology at Columbia University. He is the author of Far from the Tree and the Noonday Demon. He is an activist in politics, psychology, LGBTQ affairs, and the arts. And he has one of the greatest quotes ever on depression, which is the opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's vitality. Please welcome Andrew Solomon.
Great to be here.
Did I quote you correctly?
You did quote me correctly. I'm very impressed. Can you recite the rest of the book?
Say that last part you dropped out on my end.
I said, can you recite the rest of the book?
I can't even begin. There are a lot of topics that we want to try to get to, and we're also going to save some time for a Q&A session after this. So anybody who's watching, if an idea comes up to you, write it down, and we'll see if we can get to it. Something that I'd like to hear both of you share about is the intersection of LGBTQ issues and mental health. Anybody want to jump in first?
I can start. I mean, for me, it's really important, and my own lived experience informed my advocacy within LGBTQ plus mental health and the focus on it. The Trevor Project released a survey last year that noted that 40% of LGBTQ plus respondents of that survey seriously considered attempting suicide and having suicidal thoughts and feelings. And that just tells you a lot of the state of LGBTQ plus members' mental health. There's oftentimes a lack of representation, and it's something that I had to really struggle with when I was growing up. I didn't see people who looked like me, who sounded like me, who were talking about their mental health, and that impacted me. And it informs my work every day because I know that there's many other young people who are still currently growing up in communities that might not be as accepting, and that really does damage your mental health and just your overall life in general.
Do you feel like it's also exacerbated by being a minority?
Definitely. It's the minority aspect, but there's also intersectionality within LGBTQ plus mental health. For me, being an immigrant and coming to this country at age 2 from Mexico was something I already had to struggle with, just the battle of being an immigrant in this country, but also being a member of the LGBTQ plus community, identifying as a gay man, and not knowing if I belonged to my culture because it's ran by machismo and the idea that men are strong and brave. And, you know, I can be strong and brave and I can be gay at the same time. And for me, that's something that I really try to hone in on and just really own my light, because that's how I consider me being, you know, a member of the LGBTQ plus community. I believe it's a light, it's a gift. And I am so excited to have platforms like the one I have today to advocate and to speak on that experience.
I think, as a lot of us know, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, a lot of times the best way to break through barriers of discrimination or stereotypes is for the person who holds those myths to meet a real live human being who changes their idea about what it means to be gay or to be a minority. Do any instances come to mind, Juan, where you've connected with somebody whose mind has opened after becoming friends with you, or a coworker, or anything else?
Definitely, and thank you for that question, Paul. I experienced that even within my own family, where oftentimes growing up, I would hear homophobic comments, not necessarily from my parents, but my cousins growing up and uncles. And I think once they saw me being my true self and living my authentic truth, they were able to realize that, you know, they were putting all this pressure and all these comments that were unnecessary to a human, because they were able to see my humanity after I came out, because they knew me growing up and they knew the kind of person I was and the qualities that I had. And it didn't matter if I was gay or not, because they knew who I was to my core. And I believe that's often the experience people have when they meet people who they have all this preconceived judgments and stereotypes about. I think that's what our society needs more of, because oftentimes it's people talking at one another, it's people talking about one another, but they're never sitting down having that conversation to try to understand one another. And I think that's the most powerful way we can help change things in society.
Couldn't agree more. Andrew, you want to jump in and share some personal experiences or thoughts you have on the intersection of mental health and LGBTQ plus issues?
Well, it's interesting to contemplate one's relationship to gayness, which was for many years defined as an illness, but which is now understood and lived primarily, at least for people like Juan and me, I think, as an identity. And depression, which I also suffered from very acutely, which remains primarily an illness, but also can be experienced as an identity. I found that I grew enormously through the experience of depression and of having a mental illness, but I wouldn't describe it as desirable. And while
that might be the biggest understatement I have ever heard.
I found things that were meaningful in it, but I also kind of hate it. And I certainly hate the idea that it might ever happen to me again. Gayness, when I was growing up, which was a while ago, was seen as an illness also. And I remember wishing it away when I was a kid. And now I'm happily married to my husband and we have kids, and I have a life that was essentially unimaginable when I was growing up. And so I feel as though I've come to understand gayness not as something that I would wish away, but as something that I actually cherish. Not that I couldn't perhaps have had an equally interesting life as a straight person, but it's not the one I happen to have had. So when you talk about the intersectionality, I feel like those of us who can experience gayness entirely as an identity and not as an illness are still a very select circle. We're a circle of mostly urban, particularly male, more privileged people, privileged in one way or another, educationally privileged. Not to make universals, there's great acceptance sometimes in other communities as well. But the question is whether you can tease apart what are the traumas you've experienced because of the attitudes of your family or other people toward your being gay, and what are the ways that you can bring about change in those attitudes in order to resolve some of your own struggle with mental fragility. And Harvey Milk was once asked by a young activist, what's the most important thing I can do for the movement? And he said, go out and tell someone. And so back to your earlier question and back to Juan's response to it, I think it's in going out and speaking publicly and openly and clearly about who we are that we manage to achieve change. And hopefully the tendency toward doing that, which is so escalated, will continue to broaden. And I think it's true of mental illness too. You know, most people now know that they know someone who's gay, and lots of people still don't know that they know someone who's struggling with mental illness. And if we could take both of those closets and knock them both to the ground, I think the liberation of intersectionality that would follow would be monumental.
I totally agree. And as you were talking about those things, you know, it was occurring to me that the best solution or tool for both of those struggles is community and vulnerability. And it's so hard when you feel different or like you're going to be judged or at the very least pitied. You know, I think a lot of people who lived in accepting communities can still feel afraid of opening up because they just don't want to feel different or looked down upon, not like they're not lovable, but like they're all of a sudden different. And you know, to be patronized when you're suffering with something, I don't know, I'll speak for myself, it feels worse than isolating and not having to deal with it. And I think that's why a lot of us who struggle with mental health issues will just pull away. We believe that crystal ball in our mind that is for the most part broken. And the disease has home field advantage when it gets us alone. Share, if you would, both of you, any moments when you came out and what it felt like, not only emotionally and mentally, but maybe even physically as well, because I believe there's a big relationship between how our body feels and how our mind and our spirit feel.
Well, I at least came out, I think, quite gradually in terms of being gay and quite suddenly in terms of being depressed. I didn't talk about the idea that I was depressed until I was pinned down and unable to move and unable to function. And at that point, I had to talk to friends about it. And when I emerged from my first bout of depression, I wrote an article about it for the New Yorker, and then it was out there for everyone to see and everyone to think about. Being out as gay, I feel, is still a kind of gradual process, and it has to happen day after day after day. I've just been through the process of getting a new puppy for our family and for our son. And the breeder was located in a rural part of the American South. And we had a very pleasant correspondence, but there was a lot of sort of use of words like blessings that came into it. And I had the thought all over again, if I tell her I'm gay, is she not going to want to sell me this puppy? In the end, I said, my husband is actually going to drive down and pick up the puppy, and it all seems to have been fine. And she and I have been going back and forth about, dog beds and things like that. But there's always that sense that you have to come out all over again, and you have to tell someone all over again. And even though I've written about it, and even though I've been as public as I can be about it, I feel as though it's a daily challenge.
Yeah. I think trauma survivors also experience that. There's, I'm a trauma survivor, and there's always this fear that when I share my experience of childhood sexual abuse, that somebody's not going to believe me, or they're going to ask a question that feels dehumanizing, or just something that's going to make it awkward or uncomfortable, and that they're going to treat me differently. What advice do you have for anybody who's out there and is afraid to have a conversation with somebody that they're afraid might judge them? And Juan, feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, for me, I think having a conversation with my parents actually about coming out was really scary for me. I had, made up a huge wall, a barrier with my parents. I remember I used to not try to talk to them too much about what was going on in my life during school and stuff, because I didn't want them to question me. And before moving to San Francisco, where I pursued my higher education, I came out to them thinking like, I'm going to move. If they don't want to talk to me, that's fine. Like, this is going to be a new change in my life. And I just basically set myself up to think that they weren't going to accept me. And that was really difficult for me to do, but they did. And that was like a huge surprise. And like really physically impacted me because it felt like a weight off my shoulders. And my dad hugged me, he gave me a kiss on the cheek. My mother did as well. But I know I'm lucky and it doesn't happen to every single LGBTQ plus kid, especially from communities of color. But that was a conversation that I thought I was going to come out of defeated, not having my parents' support anymore. But that's when I felt the most loved. Because
do you remember what it felt like in your body when you got the hug and the kiss and the acceptance?
Yeah, I literally got the chills. Like it felt like, I don't know, it felt out of this world just because it was something that really impacted my mental health growing up in school. And I feel like I was labeled gay before I was actually able to admit it for myself. And that impacted me because it's like all my classmates were pointing fingers like, oh, he's gay. And I didn't even know what being gay was at that point. Mind you, I was like in elementary and in middle school, but the fact that I was able to do that with my parents and to have their support 100% meant the world to me. And I think back to that day often, and it informs a lot of how I perceive my life. Like Andrew was saying, even now, like when you go into these spaces, it's scary because you have to come out again, or you have to share some pieces of your story. And you never know how people are going to like handle that or just really deal with that information, especially like in work environment. So it can be scary and it can be traumatizing over and over again. But I do see the power and the why behind it. And I remind myself of that why to continue pushing and trying to aim for acceptance.
Yes, go ahead, Andrew.
I was going to say, I just add to what Juan has said, what he expected that didn't happen does happen to a lot of people. I mean, it's something like a third of homeless youth in the United States are LGBTQ plus. An enormous number of people are rejected by their families of origin and are taken in by other families. When we talk about the intersection between one's sexual identity and mental illness, you know, in the first place, there are the people who would have had mental illness anyway, because it's pretty evenly distributed across the population. But in general, depression in particular results from the intersection of a genetic vulnerability and triggering circumstances. And the likelihood of those triggering circumstances among LGBTQ plus youth is so enormously high that many of them are put into the situation of having to deal with mental illness who, if they lived in a more accepting world, would not. And so I think when we rally for advances in one area, we have to rally for advances in both. The activist Emma Lazarus, who was herself gay and who wrote the poem on the Statue of Liberty, said, "Until we are all free, we are none of us free." And so when you talk about the intersectionality, I almost don't feel like you fight for gay rights here and you fight for rights for people with mental illnesses there. I feel like it's all part of a larger fight for acceptance of all of us, for whoever we are, with whatever complications we carry.
Yes, and that's the why behind it. And I think it's so important. Even now, where many LGBTQ plus young people are living with their parents, maybe they had to move back from school and now they're at their parents' home where they might not be accepted. And this has been throughout the past year of the pandemic, which is, I think it's important to think about and to really be purposeful as the why behind it. And as Andrew was mentioning, having that fight in general for everyone, because I as I said, I got lucky that my parents received the news like that. But it's not everyone's case, as Andrew was just saying.
So what type of mindset going into a conversation with somebody where you're going to reveal your sexuality or your mental struggles? Is it hope for the best, be prepared for the worst? Is each situation different? Is there anything you could recommend to somebody who is about to have a difficult conversation with someone they love and are afraid of losing?
I would say in the first place, don't underestimate the people you talk to. I mean, Juan's description of a good surprise, I think, happens more often than people realize. There are lots of people who seem as though they would be unaccepting, or my positive experience with the puppy owner in the South. There are lots of people who are able to respond better than you think. But also, and it's inconvenient and it's tiresome, but it's true, you have to recognize the vulnerabilities of the person you're talking to And you have to accept that they may have entrenched attitudes. And if you want to change them, you're not going to do it in the sentence in which you say, by the way, I'm gay. That's not going to accomplish the goal. It's going to be a long process. It's going to take time. What you want is someone who's open at least to having a conversation rather than someone who slams the door. And sometimes a gentle approach is the best way to open that conversation.
I love that. And it is about unlearning and unpacking for many people, especially people who have grown up in other generations or from different cultures who might have different attitudes towards these topics. I believe the advice is that do it when you're prepared. I think for me, even though I always knew when I was out to some friends, I didn't tell my parents until I felt like I was prepared, until I felt like I had what it took to, if needed, move out on my own in order to live my life. Because that's what I realized, that I wanted to live my life on my own terms and I didn't want to live a life for anyone else. And I think it's wonderful. There's National Coming Out Day and there's this like all this media around it, but I think it's important to just do it when you're ready, when you have a support system. Not everybody has friends they can go and talk to, but just being mindful of the resources that might be available to you and where to go if you need a place.
I love it. I think so often in life, one of the best plans that we can have, especially when we're going through something difficult, is to ask ourselves, will this choice leave me cornered without options? And I think one of the pluses of having a community and a support network is we're almost never cornered. We do not go through life alone, or at least we don't have to. Talk about peer support, Juan. You've been working the warm line for Cal Hope. First of all, tell us what Cal Hope is and what it's like being a regional manager for that. I'm guessing that you do get on the phone and talk to people. You're not just filling out work shifts and telling Rick he's got the day shift on Wednesday.
No, yeah, I've been able to speak to people on the phone, and COVID and Cal Hope is a response to COVID. It's a line where people call with COVID concerns specifically. But prior to that, I was working at the California Peer Run Warm Line, which is just a peer warm line where people are able to call and receive support from people who've been there before. For me, peer support really saved my life. As I said, growing up, I didn't know what depression was. I didn't know what anxiety was. So I just knew I felt, quite honestly, like shit, but I didn't know exactly what was going on. I didn't know how to label it. One, because I didn't have the knowledge of these labels. It's not really talked about in my culture. And in school, we don't really talk about these things just yet. And for me, it was life-changing and life-saving, quite literally, for me to hear from other people who might look like me, who might come from a specific place, specific region, who get me. And that's why I got so involved in peer support. And I think it's a great service to call Warm Line because you're able to receive that support before the crisis. Oftentimes in the mental health system, people don't receive support until they're in a crisis. And I genuinely believe that we need more preventative resources and places where people can go and talk to. I really don't have a great experience in the clinical mental health field just because I went through a lot when I was trying to see a therapist. It just didn't feel right for me. And peer support was something that really saved me when I needed that support. And I think it's oftentimes what I hear from people when they call into a warm line is that they tried the clinical field, but it just didn't work for them. And people have different needs. I'm not by any means saying the clinical system does not work, because I know it works for some people, but we have to be mindful of others who might not have the access to reach a therapist, who might not have enough money, who might not have a mode of transportation or any of that. And I think that's where warm lines and peer support are so helpful.
And there's something so healing about hearing a story come out of someone's mouth that you resonate with, that feels like you're not alone. And there's also something nice about getting help from somebody that you're not paying. as simple as it sounds, I'm sure you guys have experienced this in therapy where you think they're just saying nice things because I'm paying them $125 an hour. Andrew's case is in New York City. It's probably $400 an hour. But does that ring any bells for you guys?
Well, I would point out as a general statistic that of the people who develop depression and anxiety, only half at most will seek any form of treatment or discuss it with a doctor. Of that half who seek treatment, only half will receive any form of treatment. And of the ones who receive any form of treatment, only about 25% will receive optimal and fully effective treatment. So the number of people who are being treated is really tiny, and the disgrace of the American healthcare system and its many injustices, one of them is that it treats mental health as kind of a luxury. You know, if you're a privileged person and you have fancy health insurance, then they'll cover your going in for therapy at least to some degree. And if you have financial resources, perhaps you can cover it yourself. If you're not in a privileged position, then you don't have access, by and large, to mental health coverage. And plenty of people who are in privileged positions don't know enough about their own condition and situation to be able to judge when they're getting competent care. So it's a really huge issue, and it's a real national embarrassment. And it's not only an embarrassment because it's cruel not to give mental health treatment to people who need it. It's also economically really, really short-sighted, because in fact, people who are suffering from acute depression and anxiety frequently struggle to function in the world. And if you give those people some form of treatment, many of them then have the vitality, to use my trademark word there, they have the vitality to pull themselves together and re-enter society and take better care of their children and join the workforce. And so this economy, which has been foisted on us by right-wing elements within the government, but which has never become, I think, adequately a topic for the larger population. This is really not only cruel, but also short-sighted and foolish.
Yeah, if you care about the gross domestic product, give people better access to healthcare. One of the hallmarks of depression is difficulty making decisions. And I'm sure you guys know when you're in that dark, dark place, the thought of even trying to figure out where you're going to look for help, the words you're going to use to describe what it is that you're going through feels so completely overwhelming. And I would say to anybody who's listening, who wants to be an advocate, especially somebody who has a loved one who's suffering, is to understand the difference between trying to change that person and letting them know that you are available if they want assistance when they are ready to get help. A lot of codependence, I think, can come into play when a loved one is struggling, because we think the loving thing to do is to change that person into who we want them to be. And that can be a really, really perilous path to go down. And it can not only alienate us, but it can sour that person's idea of what help is going to feel like. Oh, it's going to be a bunch of people telling me what I need to do, rather than making suggestions or, you know, combining it with people telling their stories and helping me feel a part of something bigger. Does that make sense?
That makes tremendous sense. And I think the hallmark of depression is a feeling of loneliness for people, whether they're lonely or not. Also, people who have essentially rather nice lives and suddenly begin feeling terrible are likely to self-identify as having a problem and to seek help. People who have very bleak and difficult lives often don't self-identify as having a problem, and they therefore don't go out and seek the help that would really be transformative for them, because it hasn't crossed their mind. And while it's difficult to get the help, even if you are out there searching for it, it's impossible to get the help if you're not even out there searching for it. So one of the things that we really need, and that I think peer counseling of the kind that Juan has been talking about can provide for people, is a sort of set of standards. Because often it's not that you feel awful because your life is bleak. It's that your life is bleak because you aren't feeling well enough to do things that might make it better.
Well said. Andrew, are you comfortable talking about being the parent of a non-binary kid?
I'm not the parent of a non-binary kid.
I have got to relook at my research.
I've written about non-binary kids. I'm the godparent of a non-binary kid, and I think I may have mentioned that the other day.
Okay, sorry.
Godparent rather than parent. I mean, my kids so far don't appear to be non-binary. Who knows what the future holds? But no, I have a godchild who's non-binary, and I'm happy to talk about that.
Okay, please.
Well, in writing my last sort of big book, which was Far from the Tree, I wrote about trans children. And there's been this extraordinary shift over the last 20 years. When I started doing that work, people said, how can a child be trans? And now there are trans children all over the place. In having a personal relationship with a non-binary child, I'm very aware of how much more acceptance there is than there used to be, but also how much discomfort lingers, and aware also that there are many questions about how you define yourself and why you define yourself in that particular way. I think it's fantastic that we now allow for non-binary children. It should be noted that many children who in childhood appear to be non-binary grow up to be, as they sometimes say, merely gay. And it's important to allow children a real range of identities so that in the way that they used to feel boxed into conforming to hetero norms, they don't now feel boxed into trans norms. But for my own non-binary godchild, they're doing really, really well. And I think they've experienced a kind of ease and acceptance that certainly would have been almost unthinkable when I was a child.
Any advice for the child or the parents of the child who want to begin hormone therapy?
Well, I'm a great believer in puberty blockers. They have some complications, but Lupron and other drugs like that postpone puberty so that the child has some time to think about it all. And then I think, you have to be sure that this is what the child genuinely wants, because there will be changes to the body which are not reversible. But when it is what the child really wants, I think it's an unbelievable liberation. And in some ways, I feel like in the same way that parents a generation or two ago could accept many things about their children, but not that they were gay, the parents of this generation can often accept a lot of things about their children, but not that they're trans. And the parents have to look at whether their unwillingness to see their child as trans represents an attempt to protect the child, or an attempt to protect their own view of the world and their own habits of thinking. And if you have a child who is authentically trans, then it's fantastic if you can protect that child from going through the so-called wrong puberty. It's much easier to live as a woman if you haven't developed facial hair. It's easier to live as a man if you haven't developed breasts and the widening of your hips. And if people want to live in the middle, they should be able to decide what kind of puberty they want to go through and to what extent they want to go through it. So listen is my advice. My advice is listen to your child.
It would be interesting to see in the following generations what children's rights will look like in determining what their gender or lack of gender will look like from childhood until they're 18. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I love that we're touching on generations, and I'd love to know, Andrew, like, not the differences, but what do you see today in this day and age that is still similar to when you were growing up? And I know it's still difficult till this day for many of us, especially there's this idea that now because gay marriage is legalized in the United States, suddenly being gay is completely like okay, and it's like accepting, and no, that's not the reality of it. There's still so much to do, so much to fight, especially outside of the United States. As Andrew was mentioning, there's so much more that has to be done in order for people in general to get all of these rights that we have here in the States. But in many countries, that is still not the case, where people are still being murdered for being gay, where they can't even mention that they're gay because there's quite literally no physical safety for them to even come out in these places. So Andrew, I'd love to know what some of those commonalities are in this day and age, and then when you were growing up as well.
Well, the international question, I think, is one that is front and center in one's mind all the time. We have now a Libyan refugee who's living with us, someone I met briefly when I was in Libya reporting for the New Yorker in the early 2000s. And 10 years later, he got in touch and said, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm now living in Lebanon as a homeless person. And I wondered if you could send me $100 because I have no legal status here. And so I can't make any money. And went on in that vein. And I thought, wait a minute, you were in medical school and you were doing really well and you spoke perfect English. And what is all of this? And we were able to help him to get refugee status. And then I had to say to my husband, they'd said he could come to the United States, but that they were going to send him to rural Nebraska. And I thought, okay, this isn't, not to be geographically snobbish, but I thought a gay Muslim displaced from his society is not going to have such an easy time in rural Nebraska, I don't think. So I said, no, why doesn't he come to New York? And they said, well, only if you'll guarantee his living expenses for the first 6 months. And I said to John, look, I said, I barely know this person. I said, I've been helping him out with this. How do you feel about it? And we agreed that the privilege we experience as gay people in New York is so different from the experience of most of the world that there was a kind of moral obligation to say yes. He's turned out to be a completely wonderful guy, and he's now lived with us for 5 years, and he's really become part of our family. And he's returned to his medical studies, which is really fantastic. But it's humbling to realize the things that people are still going through. And he had fled Libya after he was outed by someone who he thought was a friend, and after he had seen friends of his frog marched into mosques and shot in the back of the head. Libya is not a nice place for being gay. So these stories are very real to us, and we live closely with them and think about them a lot. So far as generationality, I think, again, there is an enlightened world, and there are people who are enlightened, and a lot of the people who are enlightened are not privileged, and they're just people who have been interested or who have thought about these subjects, or who have read something or watched stuff on TV or known somebody. There is much, much, much more acceptance, but there is still a lot of unacceptance. I feel like the young gay people I know now, many of them imagine getting married, imagine being able to have a family, imagine being able to work in pretty much whatever field they want to work in. But there's still, I mean, you said there's a very high rate of suicide among LGBTQ plus kids. A lot of the kids in the foster system, a lot of the homeless kids, a lot of all of those kids are LGBTQ, and they are still struggling as direly as they ever did, and feel afraid of the society, and are therefore often, I mean, they're more likely to get trafficked, they're more likely to be drawn into prostitution or sex work, which, you know, if they've chosen it is fine, but if they feel they have no other choices is not so fine. They're more likely to have all kinds of difficulties. And I think the sort of golden thing on the hill to aspire to is for people to feel that that they can have whatever kind of relationships they want. If they want a monogamous relationship, if they want a polyamorous relationship, if they actually don't want a relationship, that all of those options are fully available to them. When I was growing up, I felt like one of the things that people said to me, one of the things that my own mother said to me when I came out was, you're going to end up having a lonely life. That turned out not to be the case, but that was the perception. And if some people at least are now growing up without that perception, that represents generational progress. But my hope is that in the same way that I feel jealous of the things that are available to your generation, that when you're in your 50s like me, you will feel the same degree of envy for the next generation, because things will have progressed so much farther.
That's what we can hope for in the future. Is I hope I am insanely jealous of people that are younger than me. That's the not silver lining to the world progressing. I love it. We're going to segue now into some of the questions that attendees have, and I'm going to tag this one onto what we were just talking about with LGBTQ plus issues. And this person asks, it just moved up, and so I lost my place. How can allies best help people in the LGBTQ plus community? What can we do? I know that's kind of a very large general question.
I think in my perspective, is create real safe spaces. I feel like oftentimes when you go to classrooms or in just an environment, there's oftentimes posters with butterflies and rainbows that say this is a safe space. But what exactly are people doing to ensure that the space is actually safe for the people who are attending, who might belong to these communities? I think it's important to be mindful of language and to also just check up on people. I think just asking the questions is important, because if you don't ask questions, then you're not actually assessing for people's needs. I think making resources, sharing them with friends who you might know or people you might know are at a bigger disposition to be struggling, and sharing those resources is important as well.
And I think also getting out and voting and making this a priority. I mean, I'm on the board of the National LGBTQ Task Force, and one of our board members, who's currently our board chair, is a straight woman who said, this is the civil rights struggle of our time, and I felt a moral imperative to join it. I mean, there are a lot of civil rights struggles of our times, of course, but to show that people care. We would not have won marriage without the help of straight allies, and we won't win anything else without the help of straight allies. In the United States, it is currently still legal in many states to fire people for being gay, or to refuse them housing for being gay, and in some places even to refuse medical care or other services for being gay. Marriage is very nice. I happen to be married and I'm delighted, but it is not. The whole story was in many ways not even the most important part of the story. And I think there's a need for activism of every kind, and for love, and for making people feel unconditionally loved. And if you can express that love, not only the love for your own children, and maybe love is too strong a word, but make people feel that they are embraced for who they are, and that you as a straight person don't think all the time, oh, they're really nice, but I wonder what they'd have been like if they were straight. Just see them for themselves.
Yeah, I love that, Andrew. And you could do stuff locally as well in your community, reaching out to your leaders and holding them accountable. For me, I drafted a proclamation that proclaimed June as LGBTQ plus Pride Month at the age of 21, and it passed for the first time in the town's history. And that's great, and it made history. But for me, I thought about why it took 21 years, which is how old I was at the time, for this to happen. Why didn't we embrace these people who are contributing, who need to feel like they belong to this community? Why aren't we embracing them before? And when people ask, how to be better allies, it's just to be self-aware, accept, love people, go out there with them and fight for them as well.
One of the things I think many of us have probably experienced is an offhand remark that somebody makes. Maybe it's about someone being gay or trans, and you don't know whether to just let it go or say something. And if you do say something, how to say something, what are the words you choose, what's the tone that you choose. One of the hobbies that I have is playing hockey, and you can imagine a locker room full of hockey players is not a place that you would see as the most open-minded, sensitive place for conversations. And one night, a guy made a comment, I don't remember what it was, but it was something that was mildly disparaging of trans people. And as I was sitting there mulling over whether or not to say something, another guy spoke up, a guy probably about, 15, 20 years younger than me. And he just said, you know what, that's not cool. That's a real stereotype. And that's pretty offensive. And the guy who had made the joke was like, I didn't mean it to be offensive. I just, I come from a different time. And he was trying to kind of explain it away. My thought is there a way that we can help change somebody's mind, or at least let them know that feelings are being hurt and they're doing damage, without shaming and ostracizing that person? Any thoughts on that, you guys?
I think sharing the why behind it, right? I think for some people who have these thoughts, they might not know the impact that this has on young people or just LGBTQ plus people in general. I think when you make comments like that, you're not aware of the impact and how much it emotionally impacts someone, how their mental health is impacted by comments like that. And it's important to just remind them of that because they might not be aware. So it might not even be a reminder, but it just might be letting them know and making them aware that that's hurtful for people. There's people who have suicidal thoughts and feelings because their pronouns aren't being respected, which is why I think pronouns are so important. But I think sharing the why behind it is important. And I also want to validate that it is not our job to educate people, but people should be educating themselves on these topics and issues as well, because it's the reality of our society. But I think a way to handle those comments is by sharing the why, because it helps people grow and it helps them be aware that that's hurtful.
Andrew, any thoughts?
Well, I think Juan is exactly right. I think that's just what needs to be done. And I think if you approach it with the attitude of sort of, I'm going to educate you about this thing you might not know very much about, and perhaps I can be helpful, that's going to work better than being outraged and furious. Outraged and furious tends to escalate the conflict and to entrench people in their point of view. If you say, there are trans people in my life, this is who they are, this is what's important to them, or I've heard about this experience of trans people or that experience. I think if you keep it gentle, you're more likely to be able to bring about that change. There are cases where you can't keep it so gentle, but when you can, it works better.
Tell us about the bar fights, Andrew.
Yeah.
Somebody asks, would the panelists mind sharing their thoughts on how to be the most inclusive in the use of language around preferred gender pronouns?
I think if you don't know, just ask and don't ever assume someone's pronouns. That's just, I think it's very much straightforward. Do not ask after you've already given them pronouns. Don't make assumptions. I think that's always what I consider to myself and I think about often. It's like, don't make assumptions, ask people if you don't know, or use they, them pronouns if you're not aware of their pronouns already.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Ask people and remember that people's pronouns are their personal choice. And in the same way that you wouldn't just walk up to someone and say, well, your name is Stephen, but I've decided to call you David instead. You shouldn't say, okay, you say you prefer those pronouns, but I have known you for years by these other pronouns and I'm just going to stick with those. I mean, if the person has changed their pronouns, pay attention to the change in those pronouns and give them the authority to make those decisions. And certainly if you meet someone new, even if the pronouns don't match the person's appearance from your standpoint, still, they're their pronouns, they're their choice and their property.
And I would also add, and don't beat yourself up if you make a mistake and you're a well-intentioned person. Be willing to apologize and say, I'm sorry, I meant to say such and such. Or I have a friend whose name is, for the first 15 years I knew him, his name was Jamie. And he didn't transition or anything. He just now wanted to be known as James. And I still have difficulty remembering to call him James. So I think sometimes we also need to keep in mind as we're being advocates to be nice to ourselves too, and to accept our flaws and our humanness as long as we are striving to become the person that we want to be and that society needs. Is it as easy to talk about your mental illness as it is for your gayness? This person asks.
I would say that it's neither easier nor more difficult, but it's different. I think, as I said at the beginning, I feel like there is a general acceptance of the idea that your sexuality is something you are supposed to wear with pride. And the general perception in the United States as currently constituted is still that mental illness is shameful, that it's a failing, and that it's a basis for not progressing in the world as you otherwise might. So, the gay people are sort of more organized than the anti-mental illness people. So you have to be prepared for that. People get lynched, especially trans women of color, but all kinds of people in the LGBTQ range, in a way that people with mental illness don't as much. Though, of course, the police often respond inappropriately to people with schizophrenia or people with autism or people with other conditions that cause them not to interact in expected ways with law enforcement authorities. But I would say both take a lot of coming out. In the world I live in, being gay is no big deal, and being depressed has required more explaining and more conversation with people. And I feel like I run into insensitivities all the time. I mean, somebody whom I've known since high school sent me a note the other day and said, can you recommend a psychologist for me to see because I'm having a rough time? And I wrote back and said, well, given what you've described, and there's much more to his note than that. I said, given what you've described, I said, you probably should also see a psychiatrist and consider the possibility of medication. Why don't you go and at least see someone and have a consultation? And he wrote back and said, I'm not interested in screwing around with my mind with a bunch of chemicals. And I thought, okay, I've written a book about the fact that I have screwed around with my mind with a bunch of chemicals, and that wasn't the most sensitive thing you could possibly have said. I realize you're having a rough time. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it, but you run into it a lot. And I often have people say to me, so you seem like you're doing really well. Are you off your medications? And I say, no, it would be nice to be off them, but I've tried going off them and the results were not happy. So I'm just sticking with them for the time being.
One of the things that you and I talked about briefly, Andrew, was you having contact with the parents of the Columbine shooters and the parent of Adam Lanza, who was the shooter in Sandy Hook, was it? I think a lot of people, myself included, when we see somebody shoot up a school, our first thought is their parents are absent, probably abusive, and probably the cause. And as I've come to find out, once again, I'm completely wrong and have stereotypes in my head about what's really underneath. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I think that criminality, like many of the, like mental illness, like homosexuality, like other things, can occur in any family. Again, I think it involves a natural proclivity and triggering circumstances. So children who are abused have experienced more of those triggering circumstances and are probably more likely to commit crimes.
But it might be bullying at school rather than a parent who's abusive.
It's usually on a smaller scale. But the people who commit these extraordinary crimes that capture headlines are people who are disordered in some profound way and who often come from families in which either it was recognized they had a problem and every attempt was made to help them, or in which they covered up who they were so effectively and so well that the parents were shocked. And I remember going to talk to Tom and Sue Klebold, the parents of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the perpetrators, as you said, at the Columbine Massacre, which was in its time the worst school shooting in the world's history and remains the template for many that have taken place since. And I had spent years convincing them to talk to me. And when I finally went to see them, they were so full of their story that they couldn't stop telling it. And I recorded 20 hours of interviews the first weekend we spent together. And on Sunday night, we were all exhausted and we were sitting in the kitchen and Sue was making dinner. And I said, if Dylan were here now, I said, is there anything you'd want to ask him? And his father said, there sure is. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And his mother sort of looked down and she thought for a minute. And then she said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And I felt like the response was a loving and maternal response. And I really liked the Klebolds. I mean, I happen to be quite fond of my own parents, but I would have been perfectly happy to have Tom and Sue Klebold as my parents. And they did, nobody does everything right with their child, but they did almost everything right as they could. And this is still what happened. And we used to say, that it was bad parenting, that, you know, autism was caused by refrigerator mothers, and schizophrenia by parents who nourished an unconscious wish that their children not exist, and gayness by overbearing mothers and withdrawn fathers, and so on and so forth. And we've stopped blaming parents for autism and for schizophrenia and for gayness and for many other things, but we still blame the families when someone commits atrocious crimes. And while there are some people who commit crimes who are unloved, there are many people who commit those crimes who are deeply loved.
Did they experience social shunning after the event?
Oh, they experienced enormous social shunning. And I remember saying, well, why didn't you just move? And they said, if we had moved somewhere else, we would have moved in as the parents of that killer, or we could have tried to live under assumed names, but someone would have found out and that would never have worked. They said, here at least we had friendships that had history to them and that went back to before this had happened. We even knew people who had really liked Dylan when he seemed like a different person than who he turned out to be. And we didn't want to leave all that behind.
Adam Lanza's situation seems to be a bit different than Dylan Klebold's was, because Adam seems to have been really, really acutely ill in ways that were a lot more overt. Correct me if I'm wrong, but could you touch on that situation and his mother?
Well, Adam Lanza was a deeply disturbed young man, and everyone knew it. Dylan Klebold kept up a pretty good facade of being a pretty all-around normal kind of guy. You know, I saw home videos that had been taken of Dylan 3 weeks before Columbine happened, and I thought, seems like a normal guy to me. I wouldn't have been worried. Adam Lanza was wildly peculiar and couldn't deal with other people, and hid in the basement and refused to interact with the people around him. And all parenting requires a constant negotiation between the long term and the immediate term. So on the one hand, you could think, I don't want to have an argument with my child tonight, because it's not fun to have an argument with your child on any given night. And on the other hand, you would think, if my child never eats any vegetables, he's not going to turn out very well. And so there is a constant process of going back and forth between the experience of being a parent and the experience of being between the experience of making things work in the short term and the experience of making things work in the long term. And I think Adam Lanza's mother cushioned him from all of the things he found difficult and always chose what was good in the day over what would have been good in the longer term. And that ended up being a tragic decision. He had been indulged, and in the end, she was the first person he killed.
Somebody asks, how do we address mental health as a social justice issue? We've touched on that a bit. Is there anything that you guys would like to add? You know, we talked about being an advocate, and we talked about the government and the healthcare system being a bit broken, and the prejudice towards people who struggle with mental illness and their own self-judgments. Anything that you would like to add that hasn't been touched on?
I mean, you just said it. Health disparities within the healthcare system, but also just realizing that for people, meeting their basic needs sometimes really impacts their mental health. And as Andrew was saying, some people aren't aware that they're really struggling because they're made to think that this is how they should always feel. And some people label it resiliency. Oh, you're so resilient. You went through all of this. But Andrew said this earlier. If you ask those people if they would want to go through all of the stuff that they've had to go through, most of them would say no. Yes, there's lessons learned, but many people would rather not struggle and have an easy life than just continue, struggling and not having what they need in their life.
Juan, do you take meds?
No.
Okay. Andrew, how many times have you tried to go off your meds, or have you been strict with them since they started? And I apologize if that's too personal of a question. I'll go first and say, I would say 3 or 4 times with disastrous results. I have tried to go off my meds because I thought, oh, I've changed now, or, my diet's better. And, cue 3 months later, suicidal thinking, et cetera, et cetera?
Pretty parallel to what you just said. I've tried to go off them. Sometimes I've tried to change them. I frequently adjust the dosage of something. I mean, it's an ongoing negotiation and it requires a lot of management. It is, as someone I interviewed said, like being a science project with no due date. And so that's ongoing. But when I have gone off them entirely, yeah, there are usually a few months of sort of pleasant hypomania, and then there's a horrible crash. And the horrible crashes can be very difficult to dig back out of. It's not like you then just start taking your medication and 2 weeks later you're fine again. The horrible crashes are, I mean, they've been shown that that kind of horrible depressive crash is not good for your brain physiologically and anatomically. And it's also not good in terms of what it will take to regain your balance in your own life. So I got to a point now quite some years ago when I thought, unless there's some gigantic scientific breakthrough, I'm stuck with this. And, you know, I hate it. I mean, I hate the idea of being dependent on this little thing of medication. You know, I remember thinking during, I don't know, 9/11, I thought, what if the pharmacy doesn't open before next week and I run out of the medication I'm supposed to be taking? I go on trips and I have this big hand luggage that I carry with me because I have sort of a 3-week supply of medication just in case the plane crashes in some strange place, and so on and so forth. It's a real nuisance, but it has also saved my life.
And when I encounter friends who rule out thinking about going on meds, at least exploring it with a psychiatric evaluation or multiple visits to different psychiatrists to get second opinions, I always say, what are the side effects of not being on meds?
And the side effects are, as I said, ultimately, with many repeated episodes, effectively the carving into your brain of the pathways of depression. Now, there are some people for whom the meds don't work, and there are some people who are able to handle even very extreme mental health needs without the use of meds. So I don't recommend them as a universal.
Yes, and thank you for adding that.
Oh, they're so artificial. And, you know, what about the real you? And I feel like, well, the real me actually probably wouldn't brush his teeth and they would all have fallen out by now. You know, and there's nobody militating against toothpaste. Like, we all have to use the things that work for us. And also, I say, it's not like losing your virginity. You can try them, and if you don't like them, you can go off them. And if you want to stick with them, you can stick with them. So it can be worth experimenting with. And also, life is short. And if you decide not to take meds and say, I think I can fight my way out of this by myself, you might fight your way out of it by yourself, but you will never be 32 again. And you might have had less of an optimal experience than you could have had of being 32. And so I don't push meds on anyone. As I said, they're right for some people and wrong for other people, but I push being open to the idea or to at least trying it on people. I think people should not have a kind of philosophical objection to it and let time trickle through their fingers.
Yes, because a different question is, do you trust pharmaceutical companies? Well, no, but that isn't mutually exclusive from keeping the option open of taking meds. I will never fully trust pharmaceutical companies, and they have saved my life.
Right. I mean, no one trusts pharmaceutical, no thinking people trust pharmaceutical companies, I don't think, but they were the ones who had a motivation, financial or otherwise, to develop these medications. And as I said, I feel so lucky. You know, Juan and I were talking about generational things. Boy, generationally, if I had been born 50 years earlier, there would have been no treatment for my depression, and I would have had a miniaturized, reduced life in a million different ways. And the fact that I have ended up having a life that doesn't feel so miniaturized, you know, I'm lucky that I was responsive to medication, and I've done endless talk therapy too, and I still have depressive episodes, and I have bad years and good years and all the rest of it. But I still feel like I've been able to do things that I wouldn't have been able to do in another time.
Including helping thousands and thousands of people with the things that you have written, the research that you've done, the advocacy. You know, a friend of mine calls the noonday demon the Bible of depression. And whenever she gets down, she cracks it open and it helps her.
Thank you.
You must get emails and correspondence all the time from people thanking you for opening up about what you wanted probably to keep quiet about.
I do get nice letters from people, and they're very, very gratifying. People who've been helped. I also hear from a lot of people who are struggling, and I'm very aware of how much pain there is in the world, and very much aware of how common this complaint is. If you write a book about depression, there's almost no one you meet who won't say, I was wondering about, or I've been worried about my sister, or let me tell you about my wife, she just isn't, or my husband, or whatever it is. It's ubiquitous.
We're going to take one last question. This person asks, and again, like a lot of the questions, we've touched on this a bit, but maybe we have something to add. How can we support peers who want to start their advocacy journey, but find starting it too intimidating?
Yeah, there's no perfect starting point, I guess, for advocacy in general, and it looks different. You might, oftentimes there's this perception that advocacy has to be like policy, and the real answer is it doesn't have to, and you might already be doing advocacy and you might not even be aware of it. For many people, maybe advocating for your parents' health in the healthcare system, that might look like advocacy for you, and you might not be aware of that. I think what people need to realize is that there's so many other people doing it, so you don't have to do it alone. You could join your communities, your organizations, and start there. Start with other people and just build that community and that support group to push for what you believe in together.
Andrew, anything you'd like to add?
I think that's really it. I think it's helping. I always think of that Emily Dickinson poem. If I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can spare one soul the aching, or ease one pain, or help one fainting robin unto the nest again, I shall not live in vain. And so I think just start small, and then let it go and let it grow. But everyone counts.
And the only thing I would add is the simplest way to advocate is to listen. And also take care of yourself if somebody starts draining you. A lot of people, myself included, have had to set boundaries with people who didn't want to get help for themselves, who didn't want to deal with their alcoholism or deal with their depression. They wanted to talk on the phone for an hour, monopolize the conversation, talk about how sad their life is and how pitiful they are. And eventually I had to say, man, I can't help you if we're not on the same team, if you don't want to help yourself. And it feels, I don't want to feel like an audience member. There are times that we need to show up and just shut up and listen to somebody. And then there are other times when we have to listen to our body and say, this person is draining me, and they do not seem like they really want to help themselves or open their minds to what a different life might look like.
A psychiatrist I know, Helen Mayberg, said, the work I do can release the parking brake, but the patient still has to drive the car.
I love it. Juan Acosta, Andrew Solomon, thank you guys so much. A shout out to NAMI West LA for having us. And I appreciate it. Be good to yourselves. Be nice to yourselves. You're uniquely positioned to be your own best friend. Why would you talk to yourself like somebody that needs a restraining order? Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.